Welcome to Crossroads. A new law puts restrictions on AI companions. Those are the people with artificial intelligence boyfriends, girlfriends, just friends. All these are going to be impacted. And also it can be used for other things, which we'll get into. Now, like in other news, though, the government shutdown still in place. They don't look like they want to change anytime soon. And as they negotiate the terms of getting funding bills passed to reopen it, well, members of Congress are showing exactly what your tax dollars have been paying for. And it's not looking so good. Also, in other news, the Pentagon has established new rules for journalists, and a lot of legacy news outlets, they're not very happy about it, to the extent that many of them are announcing that they're going to refuse to sign it, and the Pentagon is literally waving goodbye to them, saying, don't let the door hit you on the way out, basically. I'll be talking about these topics a lot more today, so make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe to our channel, and let's get into it. Now, like first off, the old AI companions. If you have one, you may soon see it change. People have artificial intelligence boyfriends, girlfriends, AI friends. I guess people do that. These could all be impacted by new safety protocols, and that includes quite a few things, actually. California is now the very first state in the U.S. to roll all these out, and they say the goal is to protect kids. I'll add to that the same language has been used for social monitoring programs on the internet, and this could apply for that as well. Let me explain. First off, this is what California Governor Gavin Newsom says. His official website says California Governor Gavin Newsom today signed a new landmark legislation to further strengthen the state's protections for children online and create safeguards for new and emerging technology such as artificial intelligence, meaning not just for this, but including, right, AI. It says the legislation adds required features for platforms and products such as age verification, protocols to address suicide and self-harm, warnings regarding social media and companion chatbots, and stronger penalties for those who profit from illegal deepfakes. That's when you superimpose people's faces on videos or whatever else, right? It says helping to ensure children's safety remains front and center. This is what Gavin Newsom said, quote, emerging technology like chatbots and social media can inspire, educate, and connect, but without real guardrails, technology can also exploit, mislead, and endanger our kids. We've seen some truly horrific and tragic examples of young people harmed by unregulated tech. And we won't stand by while companions continue without necessary limits and accountability. We can continue to lead in AI and technology, but we must do it responsibly, protecting our children every step of the way. Our children's safety is not for sale. In other words, we're in the part of that dystopian movie where they start saying that we need to start regulating harmful AI. We're at that part. Now it says this, new safeguards on AI chatbots by establishing requirements that companion chatbot platforms create protocols to identify and address users' suicidal ideation or expressions of self-harm. So in other words, if you're talking to your AI girlfriend and you say, hey, I've had a rough time, I'm really thinking about hurting myself, the AI now actually has a system to watch for that. And I mean, hopefully that means getting you help, not like in Canada where they say, hey, let me give you services to provide it for you. Hopefully it's more like they offer you help. We'll have to see how it works. But it says platforms must also disclose that interactions are artificially generated, and minors must be provided break reminders and prevented from viewing sexually explicit images generated by the chatbot. And what does that mean, basically? That means it's going to have some kind of age verification. What does that mean? It means some ID system. That means, of course, if you want to use these AI chatbots and probably other things, which we'll get into in a bit, you may have to start using your real identity on the internet. And that includes a lot of other issues. I'll get into that in a minute, but let me go over this first. It says platforms will be required to share protocols for dealing with self-harm and statistics regarding how often they provided users with crisis center prevention notifications to the Department of Health, Public Health. It says legislation also establishes a prohibition against chatbots representing themselves as healthcare professionals. And that's a big deal, by the way, because you have some people who are turning to AI for diagnosis. Hey, AI, what mental health problem do I have today? Hey AI, what do you make of this, weird bruise I have on my arm or something like that? AI, people are turning to AI for a lot of things. It's important the language here is they're talking about healthcare professionals overall, not just mental health, but healthcare overall. And so this could actually limit the use of AI for like diagnosis across the board. Now it says this as well. Required age verifications by operating systems and app store providers to help prevent children from accessing inappropriate or dangerous content online. I'm going to go deeper into this in a minute, but this is the one part of this I'm really concerned about, because we see similar rules as this being put in place in like the UK right now. They say it's about, protecting children from inappropriate or dangerous content. I mean, who wants kids looking at like suicide ideation or pornography and things like that? The question is, how do you do it, right? How do you do it? Well, the way it looks is you put age verification. How do you verify age? A lot of sites already do it. What do kids do? They just select, okay, I'm 200 years old, let me in. The way they do it is they just type in whatever they want. The only way you can properly ensure that kids are not viewing it is real identity, is digital ID. And we see this being rolled out in the UK already. I'll get into that in a minute, but let me finish this first. It says social media warning labels to help warn young users about the harms associated with extended use of social media platforms. I can get behind that. No more doom scrolling, no more endless scrolling. In other words, you have a time limit on it. Stronger penalties for deepfake pornography by expanding the cause of action to allow victims, including minors, to seek civil relief of up to $250,000 per action against third parties who knowingly or aid in the distribution of non-consensual sexually explicit material. And that is a problem these days, because there are sites that offer this. You can take a picture of somebody and you can have these sites like automatically generate, nude photos or videos of them. And non-consensual, sexually explicit material, if a person finds out you're doing it, they can sue you for it now. That's a very big deal. You might remember actually Taylor Swift tried suing some of these sites over it because people were generating like fake, sexually explicit material about her. She was actually, I think, the first person to really bring a major lawsuit on this issue. And you do have that happening a little bit at the federal level. Actually, on the Biden side, they actually put laws in place to prevent people against, leaking sexually explicit images, even like, genuine ones. But they're also doing it now on like AI-generated ones. Now, it's not clear the actual limits to this. They're saying distribution of it. Does that mean the service providing you with it? That could be. This will probably have to go to courts, and so we'll see how it works, but I think it's a good thing. I think this whole technology is kind of creepy, to be honest, and not right. It's going to make society kind of weird if we keep going down this road. But it says guidance to prevent cyberbullying through requiring the California Department of Education on or before June 1st, 2026 to adopt a model policy on how to address reported acts of cyberbullying that occur outside of school hours, and requires local educational agencies to adopt the resulting policy or a similar policy developed with local input. I mean, this has some important uses. It also has some concerning elements tied into it. The biggest one being, how do you define bullying? Could bullying be like, you hurt my feelings today? Could bullying be like, your political views offend me? Could bullying be something like that? Could bullying be you called me by the wrong pronoun? And this may sound kind of far out, but we actually saw cases like this. We have actually seen people bring cases like this. And so in some regards, bullying has been defined like that. And what that amounts to then is like basically restrictions on free speech. Are you compelled to acknowledge a person's delusions? The other side of online bullying is it's pretty serious these days, especially with kids. Bullying, I mean, when I was a kid, it was in school and, you go home and it usually didn't impact you too much. These days, there's no escaping from it. Kids who are online all the time, they're on the internet all the time. You have, of course, AI-generated, images. They can generate images, not even just sexual, but even just making fun of kids, putting them in compromising positions. And it messes with their heads. And there are people who entertain themselves by just doing this constantly. It's not even kids doing it to kids. Sometimes it's adults doing it to kids. And so there are real problems with this. There are actually really serious problems with this. And so, it really depends on how they choose to address this, the guardrails they put in place to prevent violations of like free speech, and, what are the limits of that, right? This will be interesting to see how they roll it out. Another part they have is clear accountability for harm caused by AI technology by preventing those who develop, alter, or use artificial intelligence from escaping liability by assuring that the technology acted autonomously. And this is important because there are some AI platforms that allow for the creation of like criminal content, and the way that they, basically don't have liabilities is say, okay, we don't retain data. We don't know who you are. You don't have to give us an email. You don't have to give us a name. And people use these types of programs anonymously, right? Anonymously, or, it says here autonomously, but it's a bit mixed, right? They use it in an anonymous way where there's no accountability. They're not liable. They didn't knowingly do it. Oh, I just run this business. Who am I to say who comes in and sits down? That's kind of the nature of this argument. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means that a lot of these AI platforms, generative technologies, they're going to need to start asking you who you are. And that is the big part with this, right? That is really the big thing that this whole legislation is going to do. Like everything else aside, this means that online anonymity, when you're using artificial intelligence, could go away. Now, look, I'd agree with a lot of this. I'm not a fan of AI, as I've pretty much made clear. The extent I'll use AI for is like a replacement for Google, because Google basically doesn't pull up a lot of what I look for. I generally think AI companies are creepy. I generally think AI companions are creepy. And I generally believe the heads of AI companies warning that AI is going to destroy us all if we allow it to continue. I don't like it. But I also have some concerns with this, right? Now, among the bigger points is the idea of how age verification works. And this is a challenge with the internet overall. I don't think we should be allowing kids to access pornography. When it comes to, for example, social media, I agree that maybe kids shouldn't be using it. I think it's actually harmful to them. There are a lot of problems, trafficking, grooming, exploitation, bullying that happen on there, and I think it's really harmful to children's mental health. Not to mention the way that a lot of these platforms are set up, where they're set up to basically work in casino technology. They're made to be addictive. They're made to draw you in. They're made to make you doom scroll. And in no way, and not only that, but a lot of them make money by selling your data. And when you have kids and their data is being stolen, I don't think any of this is good. Every time you load these things up, you're basically participating in some kind of like, corporate experiment of like, social engineering. I don't like any of that. But I think there is a big issue with how do you actually implement age verification. This is one of the more difficult parts with the internet. Because we can look at the United Kingdom, the UK. In the United Kingdom, what do? They just rolled out a huge age verification program, and they're doing it under the banner of protecting children. Who doesn't want to protect children, right? They're saying we need to prevent children from seeing harmful content. Children, we need to protect them from looking at pornography. We need to stop this stuff, and this is how we do it. But what that means in practice is there are online laws against anonymity. You have to show who you are. And what does that mean in practice? Well, it means it takes the form of digital ID, digital identity. And you have your driver's license in person or your passport in person. You now have your internet passport. Everything you see and do on the internet is now tracked to you. Everything you see and do on the internet is being monitored. And everything you see and do on the internet or say can and probably will be used against you in a court of law, as we're seeing in the United Kingdom right now. Because the way they're doing it in the UK, they're saying, hey, protect children, but you have a lot of people now complaining that they say, I'm posting my opinions online politically, and some political speech is deemed hate speech. If you dislike certain policies, if you dislike, like the mass migration, there's a big deal if you dislike that. You can be labeled like a far-right extremist. They can target you. There are people having police show up at their door. And a lot of people there believe that their rights are being restricted. And then the police kindly remind them that in the United Kingdom, you don't have free speech like Americans do. But this does raise a lot of prospects. Again, digital ID and real ID. But back to the prospects of AI companions and girlfriends and such. Elon Musk, well, he's kind of going the opposite way. Elon Musk is not only saying, not only are we not restricting online girlfriends and boyfriends, you can now use Grok to give any image an online girlfriend or boyfriend. Elon Musk said this. He said, just type add a girlfriend to any video on the new Grok Imagine. And you can give Pikachu a girlfriend, or you can give yourself one, I guess, on these videos. And people are, of course, using it like that. You can now generate it on command. In interesting times, right? Now look, in other news, Speaker Johnson, he has now just revealed exactly where your taxpayer dollars are going. I'll be talking more about this after a quick break.
All right, just a pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back. The government shutdown is still in place, and it's looking like they're not going to change it anytime soon. Democrats are trying to pass bills. Republicans are basically saying, hey, I can do this as long as you want. The water's fine. And Trump is actually manipulating, he's using it to actually cut the size of government. So it's actually on the Democrat side of the court to try to negotiate something because Republicans don't seem like they really care. The government shutdown in many ways is kind of creating the small government that Trump has kind of been pushing for anyways. And Trump's using it, actually. Now, as they try to negotiate the terms of getting the funding bill passed, what it is doing is interesting. Because, look, the nature of the government shutdown is Congress has to agree on a spending bill. When they agree on a spending bill, they have to say, we want this, 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 and this, and so on, right? A lot longer than that. And what that means is that there are some things they obviously do not agree on. What is now changing is that as Republicans are seeing Democrats want this, 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 and this, and Republicans are more going for cuts than Democrats, what they're doing is they're telling the American people now, this is what they're trying to put on it. These are the terms they have on reopening the government. The government shut down right now, and they're stopping the government from being reopened because they want this particular program or that one. This is House Speaker Mike Johnson showing some of the terms put on the table. Watch this.
And they would send $500 million to liberal news outlets by refunding the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It would also restore up to $5 billion of American taxpayer funds for wasteful spending for international projects. Here's a couple of examples. This is in their legislation, their counterproposal on the CR to keep the lights open. This is what they want to do. They want to spend $24.6 million of your hard-earned dollars as a taxpayer for climate resilience in Honduras. They want to spend $13.4 million for civic engagement in Zimbabwe. They want to send $3.9 million for LGBTQI+ democracy grants in the Western Balkans. They want to spend $2.9 million of your dollars for desert locust risk reduction in the Horn of Africa, and $2 million for, quote, organizing for feminist democratic principles in Africa. We are not doing that.
So that's money for climate change programs in Honduras. That's money for homosexual programs in the Balkans. That's a lot of other things like that. You know, basically what it is, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, you know, in the U.S. is pretty controversial. They obviously want to bring it back. And this is important for Americans because, you know, that was also part of the entire, like, United States international program that was being run through a lot of our agencies, which Trump put a stop to. What's important here is we're seeing it didn't really go away. It's still being demanded. It's still being pushed. DEI, right? And of course, the other side is the, you know, all these environmental programs. But what's important and what's being shown to the American people is that, you know, the Democrats really do want this. And they want it so bad, at least in this case, that they're willing to keep the government shut down to keep it. Now, normally the public is not shown this kind of stuff. Normally it's, you know, maybe guys like me or, you know, another, you know, people do a show, they might show you what's in it, but normally you don't see it really being discussed so broadly like this, let alone getting this much attention, because typically people don't care that much, right? But when the government is shut down and someone's basically holding the government hostage saying, you know, let's say open it up or your payroll gets it, it kind of makes it a bit more real, right? And so as there's more attention to this, people are paying attention. And programs like this, you know, they've actually been in place a long time, these kinds of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. But the broader public, you know, they only really started seeing the details when the DOGE department, you know, formerly under Elon Musk, was investigating and exposing it. They were saying, hey, USAID is giving money to this and that and that. And people were kind of shocked by it. It turns out it's not gone. They're still pushing for it, and they want it so bad they're willing to keep the government shut down to get it. Now, on that point, those of you saying, well, geez, are they going to pass it? The Republicans came out, and they basically said they can keep the government shut down kind of indefinitely. Because the way it's working is this. What Trump is doing right now is he's passing different regulations to fund things that are more on the Republican side. They're keeping the military funded. They're keeping certain government offices funded. They're funding the things they want. And they're basically using the shutdown to get rid of everything they don't want. So this is kind of serving their interests at the moment. Now, like in other news, though, the Pentagon has also established brand new rules for journalists. Basically, this is to prevent leaks. They've had a big problem. You might remember like a journalist being added to their private chat group when they want to go carry out an attack. A journalist randomly starts reporting on it, and it throws a wrench into government action. That's dangerous for the military. That's dangerous for, you know, the men and women at arms. That's actually risky in terms of being able to get things done because our adversaries can just move things or whatever else. And, you know, if you or I were to, well, I guess I'm a journalist, but probably not me, but if most people were to do that, you'd probably get charged with espionage if you're leaking national security secrets in ways that can get people killed, in ways that can actually mess up like U.S. military actions. That's the kind of stuff that spies do. And the problem is, you know, journalists were not really held by those laws, and so you have them wandering around the Pentagon making their little, you know, backroom deals, getting sources, and they're leaking things that are dangerous for the U.S. military. Now, I'll go over kind of both sides on this because a lot of outlets are not happy about it. They're really worried about it, and a lot of them are saying they're not going to sign it. Now, Matt Murray, executive editor at the Washington Post, issued a statement. He said this: journalists from the Washington Post will not be signing the Pentagon's new press access policy. He said the proposed restrictions undercut First Amendment protections, placing unnecessary constraint on gathering and publishing information. Basically saying this will inhibit the freedom of news outlets. And the argument is sometimes journalists have anonymous sources. Sometimes journalists have, you know, people who provide information to them. Part of that is the check and balance, you know, the checks and balances we put on government. It's part of the reason why media exists. And if you criminalize it or sign an agreement to not do it, you could be sued for it or who knows what else. And they don't want to take that risk. They say, quote, "We will continue to vigorously and fairly report on the policies and positions of the Pentagon and officials across the government," meaning they're not going to go to the press briefings, but they're still going to report on things in their own way. Now, similar statements were issued by other legacy outlets, The Atlantic, The New York Times. They all had statements along these lines. In response to this, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth reacted on X by posting a hand-waving emoji saying, "Goodbye, farewell, don't let the door hit you on the way out." You know, basically that kind of tone, right? And he also responded, Hegseth, by posting a summary of the rules. Basically, here's what he said. This is all they're agreeing to. Press can no longer roam around the Pentagon facility freely. In other words, you show up for the press conference, you're not going to be walking around freely, meeting with your buddies behind closed doors, knocking on the door of that colonel who's been providing you with like secret documents. Those days are over, at least in the Pentagon. They say press need to wear visible press badges, meaning you can't slink around in the shadows and like quietly listen in on people's conversations. And he said credentialed press are no longer permitted to solicit criminal acts. And in my opinion, that last part is actually the most important. And I have mixed views on it, right? And here's why. That's actually pretty accurate in terms of what the rules are. But, you know, the issue many journalists have with that is that, you know, last part I mentioned. A lot of journalists develop their own sources. I have a lot of my good sources. I have a lot of sources who give me kind of, you know, stuff that's not really public. Any good journalist has that. That's how you get exclusives. That's how you get tips. That's how you know if something is going wrong. You know, past 4 years, I was kind of on the other side of this, right? And I was reporting a lot of things that got me in a bit of trouble. But, you know, that's also part of the role that journalists play. It is the checks and balance. We're the watchdogs. We're the people supposed to be kind of keeping an eye out. Are you being told the truth? Is the public narrative the accurate one? And in order to verify this, we have to develop sources. That is the way that good journalism works, especially investigative journalism. And, you know, sometimes what's being said on the surface is not the real truth, right? Sometimes information being leaked to journalists, though, could qualify as a criminal leak. Now, if you go by the Journalist Code of Ethics, a journalist is not only supposed to, you know, verify information, to, you know, take steps to make sure they're doing original reporting, right? Seek the truth and report it. A journalist is also supposed to minimize harm. And a lot of people forget about that. If you're minimizing harm, that means you're not doing frivolous hit pieces. If you're minimizing harm, you're thinking about the implications if you know, blow the lid on a U.S. military operation and you get American troops killed, right? If you're minimizing harm, there's a lot of things you're not going to report on, even if it's true, even if it's there, because you're not just reckless, right? There is a degree of responsibility that comes with the, you know, the title of, you know, or the access, I should say, of being a journalist, and not everybody follows that. You have some journalists who report false information. You have a lot of journalists who report hearsay. It turns out to not be true. You have a lot of journalists who just flagrantly, you know, post about U.S. military actions. When the lives of American troops are on the line, they can get people killed. Sometimes they leak things to the press that, you know, blunt military action. Like, for example, if we're going to go launch a military action in the Middle East, New York Times sent and reports it. And what happens? Well, okay, anybody remember, for example, the whole weapons of mass destruction narrative that pulled us into a full-scale war? Well, you know, it turns out that was fake, and how many Americans were killed because of that? Was that intentional? I don't know. But a lot of Americans died, and a lot of other people in other countries died because of fake, irresponsible reporting. And you can thank New York Times for that weapons of mass destruction fake report, right? This is part of the reason why journalists are supposed to take, you know, some responsibility. But that's also the point of an outlet signing an agreement like this. You know, part of that is because they don't want that to happen. Those anonymous leaks, those backroom deals, those secret sources, those rumors, that hearsay, sometimes even tainted by the bias of the individual. Sometimes it's not true, sometimes it's a half-truth, but oftentimes it's reported as a full truth. You have a lot of fake stories that get out there. The issue for journalists, though, is if you sign a contract saying I'm not going to report stuff like this, it could also carry legal obligations if you publish a story that violates it. And look, that gets complicated. I can give you a personal example. When COVID was happening, the outbreak and everything like that, I actually had a lot of sources who were in the military, and they were, giving me documents on military protocols for vaccinations. You had a lot of military, troops. I know a lot of Navy SEALs. A lot of officers were talking to me, and they were saying that they were putting religious exemptions in place that were not being accepted. I reported that. The military now has taken steps to correct that. They are offering even back pay to troops. So, they've admitted that they believe they were wrong in having those policies. But had I signed something like this, I would have been legally liable, and I would not have been able to report it without facing some kind of repercussion. That is the actual challenge with signing a document like this. And so I do understand why media are refusing it, but it is complicated, right? I can see both sides with it. There are a lot of outlets that do just report false information. A lot of them do it, I'd say, out of political interest, partisan interest. Unfortunately, the honesty of the media, I believe, is deeply tainted now by partisan politics and special interest. And, is something like this necessary to protect our troops and protect military actions? I don't know, maybe it is, but it does bring some other complications, of course. Now, look, on another topic, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is increasing its programs to persecute religions, and they're expanding it. The Chinese Communist Party is now expanding its attacks on Christians. Christians in China are now facing additional problems. Breitbart says this: the Chinese Communist government launched its biggest crackdown on Christians in years, I think going back to around 2017, over the weekend, detaining dozens of pastors from house churches. Those of you curious, in China, under the Chinese Communist Party, they have state-run versions of the religions. There's the China Buddha Association, which is the government-run Buddhism. It's not real Buddhism. It's basically a government office, and it's fake. It's a perverted, deranged alteration of the religion that is just a government-run institution. They do the same thing with Catholic Church. They do the same thing with Christians. They do the same thing with all religions. They have government-run versions where they alter the books. They alter the Bible. They alter the Ten Commandments even. You can't have the first one, for example, in a lot of places. If you have a church, you have to have you can have the cross and Jesus, but you need to have Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong's picture above them because, they're supposed to be higher. They have crazy requirements like this. And so the house churches are the ones that operate outside of that. And if you operate outside of it, the CCP brands you as a criminal. Any unregulated religion they call a cult. So if you're practicing real Christianity in China, they call you a cult. If you believe in democracy in China, they say it's a cult. Just in terms of how broadly they use that label. And so when you have media saying the Chinese Communist Party says it's a cult, they call every belief that is not regulated by the government a cult, right? So that's just how they use the label. But it says among the individuals being arrested is Pastor Ezra Jin Mingri, the founder of one of China's biggest evangelical churches, one of the, again, house churches. And he said this. This is according to Sean Long, a U.S.-based pastor and spokesman for the Zin Zion Church. He said, what just happened is part of a new wave of religious persecution this year in China. It says Long said almost 30 pastors and church members were detained across China in the crackdown, and about 20 of them remain in custody. Further, it states that Zion is one of China's underground churches or house churches, a movement that grew after the Chinese Communist Party took control of organized religion through a program known as the Sinicization. And the Sinicized churches, temples, and mosques are controlled and licensed by the authoritarian regime, the CCP in Beijing, and they're required to teach Communist Party doctrine as part of their services. Wild stuff, by the way. And so, for example, with the Catholic Church, they acknowledge the Pope. They also have to acknowledge the Chinese Communist Party. I've heard from pastors put the 10 Commandments on their wall, and they have a Communist Party official come in and say, you can have them, but not that first one, which is, you should put no other God before me, because in their eyes, communism should come first, right? Xi Jinping and Mao Zedong come first. There are a lot of churches where they force you to have like golden idols of Mao Zedong, and I think Christians know the warnings about golden idols to like weird deities, right? You're not supposed to have it, but they're forced to do things like this because of the Chinese Communist Party. The altered version of the CCP's Bible, the part where, there's a famous one that's pretty well known, the part where Jesus, people are getting ready to stone a woman to death for having an affair. Jesus steps in and says, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. People realize all of them are guilty in some way and they don't do it. In the Chinese Communist Party version, Jesus kills her himself, right? No forgiveness. That's the CCP's altered religion that masquerades as the religion. Now, further, and it states this. According to Pastor Jin's daughter, dozens of underground church leaders in provinces across China were either publicly arrested or quietly made to disappear over the weekend. We're not going to shut you down, but you gotta disappear, right? That's how they do it. It says the charges filed in most of the cases resemble those filed against Jin, accusing the detainees of distributing unlicensed religious material online. Now, what is unlicensed religious material in China? That means you're distributing the real 10 Commandments. That means you're distributing actual Bibles. I actually know a lot of Christians who do missionary work in China. A lot of you know that if you a lot of them smuggle Bibles into China. And a lot of them know if you get caught with Bibles in China, the CCP will attack you. They'll persecute you because that's unlicensed religious material. They have a government-run version of it and they call everything else a cult. And that's how the CCP does it. It says in April, China's State Administration for Religious Affairs imposed new regulations on the online activity of religious clergy. Among the other measures, the new regulations banned religious leaders from acting as online influencers, appearing in live streams, hosting religious discussions in chat rooms, or posting videos of their sermons. In other words, all of the activities that helped house churches grow so rapidly during the pandemic. You got to keep it in your building. You make it public, they're going to come after you. Now, actually, this is big too, because a lot of these churches being cracked down on right now, they were kind of the gray area churches. There are the churches, like the Christian churches in China, that are completely persecuted, like completely persecuted. And then you have some that are like kind of tolerated by the CCP, meaning they kind of play the games with the CCP. And then you have the ones that are just utterly, absolutely controlled by it. What actually happened during the pandemic, during the lockdowns and everything else like that, a lot of people became very religious. In China, there's actually a resurgence of religion taking place. A lot of people are becoming Christian, for example. I believe the number of Christians in China several years back topped 100 million. And when that happened, I said basically, that's the threshold of persecution. As soon as there are too many religious people in China, the CCP will try to destroy them. The same thing happened to Falun Gong. They hit 100 million people. The CCP started persecuting them, like brutally. And we see this now with Christians. The CCP now is really turning to crush Christianity. Basically, under the Chinese Communist Party, again, they have altered versions. And even if you become too influential with the approved versions, they will attack you. They will try to destroy you. And, that's problematic too, because what that means is that the state-approved religions, they're not real religion. If you practice a state-approved religion in China, you're worshiping the Chinese Communist Party. You are not worshiping God. And that's crazy to say, but it's true. And it's literal. You literally have to pray to Mao Zedong. It's insane, but that is the way it works in China, under the Chinese Communist Party. All right, folks, that said, questions, comments, anything you want to talk about, leave it in the chat. Let's jump into a discussion. And let's see here. Let's see, first question, Moldegard, you're saying, emotions are the manipulation. Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, emotion is the least logical part we have in ourselves. I mean, I don't know. I think it can go both ways. And I know I'm getting outside what you're talking about, but I think people do need like emotional intelligence, but unregulated emotion is also just as problematic as a cold, by the book, tyrant. But emotions are very easily manipulated. So I believe you're talking about like online regulations and grooming and that kind of stuff, and it's crazy. You have a lot of like online grooming, you have a lot of love bombing that takes place, and you have a lot of people who manipulate people's emotions in order to control them. There's a lot of that taking place. Oh, you're talking about, oh, sorry, just being clear from our producer. You're talking about the CCP's no religion, right? Emotions are the manipulation. Well, and I think the biggest emotion they try to regulate is fear, because, nobody wants to be thrown in the gulag, right? Nobody wants to have their organs harvested. In China, of course, under the CCP, the main persecuted group with organ harvesting, where they take you and use you as a living source for human organs, and they kill you for it, so they can, as Xi Jinping said, live 150 years or live forever. Crazy, right? There are cases where government officials in China get like 7, 8 like organ transplants. They switch them out like it's like it's a product, right? They kill people like it's going out of style just for their organs. So it used to be mostly Falun Gong practitioners. They're now doing it to everybody. They're doing it. They're pulling people off the street. They're killing them for it. They're doing it to like political prisoners. Hey, you believe in democracy a little too much. Time to go support the 150-year lifespan of your local official. There are cases of them doing it to house Christians. There are a lot of cases of them doing it to Muslim Uyghurs. I've heard Tibetan Buddhists, but currently in China, Tibet is under such lockdown that I know I've even talked to some Tibetan human rights activists. Even they have trouble finding out what's going on in like the persecuted parts of Tibet. And so the situation in China is still very dire. It is still very bad. And when you see these, polished images of these TikTokers saying, China living in the future, look at all the neon lights, like a bunch of it's like moth intelligence. Look at the pretty lights. They're not showing you this kind of stuff. They're not showing you the human rights abuses. I don't think you can judge the civility of a society by high-speed rails and electric cars. I think you judge the civility of a society by how it treats its citizens. And if you're not allowed to have free speech, if you can't have freedom of belief, if you can't take your money out of the bank, if you have digital ID, if you're monitored everywhere you go, if you have no basic freedoms, I think you're living in a hellhole. I don't care how technologically advanced you think you are, you're living in hell. It's ridiculous. And so I disagree with the way these things have been framed by a lot of media. But what kind of a regime harvests the organs of people and then goes and brags on TV saying we can live 150 years by doing it? Like, what kind of a sick person does that, right? Another question, Seymour Butts, you're saying, forget emotional intelligence. We should all pray for discernment. Okay, Seymour, I agree with you. Maybe that's what we're missing as a society, some good old discernment. Yeah, I'd agree with you, I was be curious, too. We're moving to a new office, and so they moved my cup. And so I'm using a cheap paper cup for my morning coffee. We're going to have a new setup soon. Yeah, Lucy Park, you're saying, make George Orwell fiction again. Well, and I was actually thinking this. If you think about what George Orwell really represented, what was it? It was controls on information and controls on opinion, right? He was really warning about like thought control. You had, of course, the woman he falls in love with, who is part of like some feminist movement where they were like, swearing themselves to like celibacy for Big Brother, and they wore like the sashes. And they had forbidden love because all love was forbidden in the story, not just any love, right? What's really ironic is what Orwell warned about is true. And I know there's all these arguments. Well, Orwell was warning about fascism. He wasn't warning about socialism. Let me tell you the real story of that. if you actually read, it's not in the main book, but it's in the index. So if you can find a copy of George Orwell's 1984 that still contains the index, at the back, which a lot of the new copies do not have. I have a couple copies that actually have it. And every time I find a used one, I buy it. You'll see that George Orwell actually has explainers on all the concepts he introduced in the book. He has really in-depth explainers on how he came up with the idea of newspeak, how he came up with the idea of black-white, doublethink. He came up with all these concepts, right? He explains it. He also explains what ingsoc is, I-N-G-S-O-C. And so ingsoc, the entire regime, is, in his words, English socialism. What George Orwell was imagining was the trajectory of socialist ideas in his time and how they would develop over the course of time by 1984. And so he was imagining what the trends that he was observing would morph into. And so 1984 was a warning of the trajectory that he believed his country was on, right? If these things were truly practiced. And what is it? Surveillance state, and again, being advocated by the socialists during his time. It is true that he fluctuated between different movements, socialism, anarchy. He was betrayed by them eventually. It's mixed, right? The way a lot of people argue that George Orwell was a socialist or whatever is they argue that the principles Orwell believed in represent current values that people on the left say they believe in, which is not true. He was warning about a lot of the totalitarian policies. He was warning about not like right to vote, but like totalitarian feminism, which was like the, all relations are, evil, basically. That's when he was warning about like the anti-love movement. He was warning about revisionist history, people rewriting history. He was warning about government control of media, which, the consolidation of media was really taking place during that time. He was warning about surveillance, government surveillance, and the emerging surveillance state. The world saw that post-World War II with East Germany and West Germany, where East Germany had a surveillance state, right, the Stasi. So he was looking at these things in a very real way. And so, George Orwell's 84 was really a warning about this stuff. And, the unfortunate reality is a lot of what he warned about is normal these days. But, it's painted with neon lights, let's say. And so it doesn't have that dreary post-apocalypse kind of, hellhole that Orwell was talking about. It has pretty neon lights and anime girls and stuff like that, but it's the same thing, right? Have you ever seen the meme where there's socialism and democratic socialism? And socialism is like a black and white boot, like crushing people, right? And then they say democratic socialism, and it's a rainbow-colored boot crushing people, and there's like confetti coming out of it. That's the version we have. We have the one with rainbows and confetti, but it's the exact same thing. Sandy Sefkik, you're saying these countries can find their own funds if it's all so fired up important to them. Why should we fund it? Yeah. Well, I've said before that socialism is, one of the things it is it's subsidized failure. Socialism allows for things to exist that should not work. So, for example, like, if you're talking about the Balkans getting like homosexual education programs, like if they have a limited budget, would they prioritize that kind of program? Would you have mandatory vaccination programs or programs for like birth control in Latin America, like literally to reduce populations? If you want to have access to health care, if people didn't really want to fund it, right? Would you have, for example, transgender fish studies, or taking beagles and, letting flies eat them, like it turns out some of the medical experiments in the U.S. were doing? Would we fund that if it wasn't being funded by our tax dollars? Probably not, okay? Because the reality is, for anything to function in a free market economy, it needs to be sustainable. And what does that mean? It means the public needs to demand it. Who decides what's sustainable or not? Public demand is what decides it. So if people are going to pay for it, people are going to buy it, that's sustainable. What is something that fails? People don't want it, people don't buy it. If people aren't going to buy what you're selling, you're going to go out of business unless you change your product to something they want. The only way you get around that is subsidies. It has to be subsidized through an external force. It's propped up artificially. Now, sometimes that's done through the corporate systems, right? You can look, for example, at social media. Social media is not directly profitable. A lot of it is propped up by, selling your data to big businesses and advertisers, right? A lot of media is not profitable. They're propped up by advertisers trying to reach audiences. I think Epoch Times is probably one of the few exceptions to that. Last statistic I saw, Epoch Times were about 95% funded by subscribers. So we exist because you all want it, right? We're giving you what you want. We're a living example of the free market functioning, because without you all, we wouldn't be able to be here. We're censored too bad, And so on that point, as Sandy's noting, these countries, would they have these programs if we weren't paying for it? The simple answer, I think, is probably not, because they wouldn't prioritize it. They go by their priorities, and they'd have to weigh, is this important enough for us to pay money to when we don't have a lot of money? And a lot of these programs are being artificially propped up, I'd say, through American taxpayers, ironically, in this regard. New Life Forward 2018, you're saying fear is the same mechanism in the U.S. for allowing for law-abiding people. That's why we have been overrun with illegal activity. Yeah, and it's crazy, right? And we can all observe it. I think that, and I know it's controversial, but I'm going to say it anyways. Look at that, right? During COVID-19 and the lockdowns, you had a lot of churches that were shut down, and a lot of them were just kind of forced into that. Now, that brought up a big point. Well, if your church is shut down, do you just go with it? Or do you believe that religion is important enough that it should function regardless of, do you believe that it's legal even for, constitutionally to have churches shut down like that? A lot of pastors said no. A lot of pastors said, well, geez, you can shut down my church and have people come kick down my door and drag the pastor out and arrest him, which happened. It happened in many states, including, I think, California. You had people getting charged for it. But you're keeping the strip club open. You're keeping the marijuana dispensary open. You're letting people riot and protest under the Black Lives Matter banner, burning down buildings, and that's allowed, but I can't have a church sermon. At that point, you did have a lot of pastors who said, you know what, I don't think this is legal. I don't think it's constitutional. And I believe they're violating the law through the use of fear. One of my personal good friends, Pastor Brian Gibson, awesome pastor, incredible guy, again, a good friend of mine. He was one of the pastors who opened his church up during the lockdowns. And, his story was funny. I talked to his wife, and she was kind of laughing about it. He got a glass of wine, and he stayed up all night long, calling every single pastor he could find, and told them, all night, all day long, open up your church, quit being a wimp, quit being a pansy, time to open up the doors. This is ridiculous. And he actually got a lot of churches to open their doors. And you know what that was? That was them saying, we have rights, we have the Constitution, and there are limits that we believe you're violating by telling us we don't have these. And so he overcame fear by standing up to what did turn out to be unconstitutional actions, right? The shutting down of churches during that time. And so, that was an act of resistance. A lot of people in the military had, for example, religious exemptions, or claimed they did. A lot of Navy SEALs refused to get, forcibly vaccinated. Many of them, again, did it on religious exemption. And in the military, you actually have very broad powers, very broad authority for religious belief. It's not like they have to open up the Bible and say, where does Jesus say you can't get the COVID vaccine? It's not like that. In America, under the Constitution, your personal belief is your religion, and that is what is protected. So if your personal belief is you don't agree with this law or that law, they look at whether you actually believe it, whether you're devout in this belief, and they can't tell you have to do it. There are a lot of restrictions to it. Now a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost their pensions. A lot of people were basically fired, dishonorably discharged, which really messes up your future. I knew a lot of people who were like months away from retiring, and they gave up everything they had because they believed that the requirements violated their religious beliefs. And that was a very hard decision to make. That is a rough decision to make, right? Because that's your family, that's your future, that's what you've worked for the last 20, 30 years, and a lot of people gave it up. I would say that is a conviction to belief. And you know what happened? Turns out a few years later, all of them had their ranks renewed. All of them were offered their positions back. All of them were offered an apology. All of them were given back pay. And all of them got the acknowledgement that you were right, and this was an unconstitutional use of law that led to effectively your persecution. And you did see that people who stood by their beliefs, regardless of fear, regardless of threats, they were right in the end. And I do believe that often, not in every case, but in a lot of cases, that's how fate tends to roll things out. You know what I mean? I do believe that if you have a type of righteous conviction like that and you stick by it, history will show that you were right, and those are some living examples of it. All right, everyone. That said, join me again tomorrow, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. I'll be on the road yet again doing some reporting. I'm not a desktop journalist, and so those of you who watch Crossroads regularly, you will regularly see me reporting from hotels and random stuff. I do a lot of on-the-ground reporting. So join me tomorrow while I'm on the road. In the meantime, please don't forget to like and share this video, and let me know what you think. I mean, do you agree that, what boundaries do you put on it? Because you could say that personal belief should probably have some restrictions. Some people believe in some pretty crazy stuff. The limit I would put on it is when your belief requires you to harm others. Like, I don't believe in that one bit. But there are some limits to it. Like, is a pastor opening up a congregation harming others? Like, how do you weigh it? I want to hear your thoughts on it. Tell me in the chat, what do you think? What are the limits on that? Should there be limits? Let me know. That said, join me again tomorrow, as I mentioned. In the meantime, like and share. It does help us get the word out. And as always, please stay informed and stay free. Thank you.